Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we will talk about ex-Chief Justice of India Ranjan Gogoi being nominated to the Rajya Sabha. We will also look at the latest travel restrictions imposed by the government. But first, we talk about India's testing strategy against COVID-19, the disease caused by the coronavirus. Yesterday, the virus claimed its third life in India. This was the case of a 64-year-old man who had tested positive in Maharashtra after returning from Dubai. As of now, Maharashtra has the highest number of reported cases in the country, at least 39 as of this recording, while the total cases in the country are at least 137. When talking about the number of positive cases detected, it is important to note that they are determined by the extent to which the government is testing for them. The way and to what degree you test gives you a better understanding of just how big the crisis is. And the decision about how many and whom to test is determined by various factors like technical competency, trajectory of the disease, and the available resources. In the first segment, we speak to Karishma Mehrotra, who recently interviewed officials from the Indian Council of Medical Research, or ICMR, the apex medical research body in the country, about India's testing strategy to combat COVID-19. Karishma, you spoke to the officials from ICMR, you spoke to scientists there. What is their strategy? How are they combating the coronavirus? What is their plan to test for it?
So, right now, the stage that ICMR says we are at is stage 2, which means just local transmission. So, right now, what they have to determine is whether or not the virus has spread in community transmission, which the difference is stage 2, the virus is spreading to people where we can track their history back to an original source. So it's in a sort of contained, localized contact network. Whereas community transmission is it starts popping up with patients where we don't know how they've gotten it. So as of now, ICMR says we are at stage 2. To track for whether or not we've gotten to stage 3, they've made the decision not to expand necessarily the testing criteria, wherein anybody who feels symptoms can go to the hospital and get a test. Instead of doing that, they've decided to test random samples across the nation at 51 different labs. So roughly 10 samples per week at each of these labs will be tested. Now, these samples are from patients who have influenza-like illnesses or severe acute respiratory illnesses. And if any of those samples come out as positive for corona, then we know, okay, that in certain areas in this country, we are seeing community transmission, in which case the authorities would step in, ramped up testing and ramped up quarantine measures in those specific areas. So rather than taking an approach where you increase the testing criteria across the country, they've decided to first figure out, okay, is there community transmission happening and where is it happening in the country? And then ramp up those measures in those specific areas. So we should hopefully be seeing results from their second sampling period, which happened between March 1st to March 15th, starting today. And then we can sort of track how the strategy and if the strategy changes. They're reviewing the strategy, they say, every 4 to 5 days. And they said that it's been debated heavily within the ICMR about increasing testing. India has fallen under quite a bit of heat for not testing enough, that some critics say. This is because if you look at the countries who are experiencing heavy outbreak right now, and you do some comparisons, the countries that don't seem to be able to mitigate the outbreak and it's growing exponentially, countries like Italy, other countries in Europe, Iran, maybe the US as we track it, they're not doing as much testing as, say, a country like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. So this has led a lot of critics looking at the Indian strategy to say that why are we not testing enough?
So why use random sampling as opposed to actually expanding your testing? Is it a matter of how we are assessing our resources?
So I also asked one of the ICMR scientists who are in charge of this testing strategy and the sampling strategy. And her response was primarily twofold. One is she had said that let's look at this disease, okay? This virus, it's an incubation period of roughly 2 to 14 days. She said, looking at the nature of the test, somebody who has a longer incubation period, an incubation period means the time between which a patient is infected and the patient begins to show symptoms. She said, if I test a patient who has a longer incubation period, that means, let's say, I am not showing symptoms yet, and the test might show negative because I have a longer incubation period, but it's not an assured negative. In which case, then the hospital tells that patient, this is not a definite negative. That patient is going to want to test again and again. So she said this would lead to a cycle of futile testing and a lot of wastage of testing. The second that she said is, let's say you have mild symptoms and you do end up being positive. Right now, the strategy that the country is taking is emphasizing home quarantine. If we start getting a ton of positive tests for mild symptomatic patients, the worry is that every single mild patient, positive patient, would want to be held in a hospital isolation ward, which we don't have the resources for across the entire country. So her basic quote was, she has to rationalize how to go about this strategy in a place like India. And you can't immediately put in place maximum aggressive measures across the country. And they have to be careful of futile testing. So as of now, she said, all of those measures will go in place once they figure out, okay, is there community transmission happening in certain places in the nation? So that's the sort of rationale that ICMR has come to terms with.
What kind of capacity does India have right now for testing? How many tests can we do, say, in a day?
So the government right now currently has a testing capacity of roughly 6,000 per day. We have a total of 1.5 lakh tests. We've ordered 1 million more from Germany, and we've conducted roughly 6,000 tests total as of early yesterday. These numbers might have changed today. That means that we definitely are not testing up to our complete capacity. But the main thing that the scientists at ICMR said that I thought was a huge takeaway, she said, though we are maintaining a stringent inventory, we also need to make sure that we are not in a situation where I exhaust all my testing capacity in futile testing. And tomorrow, if there's an upsurge in cases, I say that I've exhausted all my tests. What will we do in that situation? The better strategy that the government is following is that we've begun the surveillance. Surveillance for her means this random sampling that I've described, as we did in the Zika virus outbreak. We did aggressive house-to-house testing and even testing of asymptomatic individuals. That means individuals without symptoms. That kind of aggressive containment strategy will be enforced wherever we see a community transmission. So yeah, I think that it's clear from the numbers that we're seeing that we have more capacity of testing. But from the logic of what I heard yesterday from ICMR, we need to sort of maintain that inventory and be rational or logical with how we use that inventory in the coming days.
Okay, so right now, India is not looking at the private sector. There are no tests happening in private hospitals. Are they looking to expand these testing to those sectors, to private hospitals?
Yeah, it seems that ICMR has started a dialogue with private labs, and they've explored the option that under CSR, they can provide free of cost testing. Apparently, they have some labs who have started the process of ordering the reagents, and they've told ICMR that they might be ready in about a week or so. So they've started that dialogue. Let's see where that conversation goes.
Do they have a sense of like when and if community transmission will happen? Like, are they prepared for that scenario?
So from the conversation I had yesterday, it seemed like they are prepared to see some amount of community transmission in certain parts of the country. So what the scientist said yesterday is she doesn't think it'll be a nationwide outbreak, but that you could see small clusters of community transmission, that they're hoping through aggressive strategies in those specific places, it can be alleviated. So experts have sort of gone back and forth about whether or not a virus like this will dip down in rising temperatures and drier weather. And from the scientists I spoke to in ICMR, the experience that India's had with influenza and the H1N1 pandemic of 2009 shows that they are hoping for some sort of reduce in transmission of corona during those times. But even with the lessons from these previous viruses, every region in India has such different climatic conditions. So even in influenza, they had documented that there was a very different seasonality to the virus in different parts of the country. So for this virus also, they're expecting some amount of dip if they do see community transmission during the hotter weather. But if the community transmission is quite widespread, if it's in certain parts of the countries that are experiencing a different type of climate, the upsurges could continue. So it's very unclear right now what, the timeline of this could be.
Next, we talk about Ranjan Gogoi. On Monday, the ex-Chief Justice of India, Ranjan Gogoi, was nominated to Rajya Sabha by the government. And yesterday evening, he accepted that nomination, saying he wants the legislature and judiciary to work together for nation building. The decision has sparked criticism from the opposition and his former colleagues. The nomination has also once again put a question mark on the independence of the judiciary and put a focus on such post-retirement benefits. To talk about it, Apurva Vishwanath, who reports on law for the Indian Express, joins us on a call. Apurva, could you talk about why Ranjan Gogoi's nomination in the Rajya Sabha? Why is that creating so much controversy?
So I think firstly, the question of post-retirement jobs for judges itself is a huge topic of conversation in the judiciary. Should judges take up jobs after they retire, especially when they are offered by the government itself? And that is controversial because it sort of puts a shadow on the independence of judges. So if they're hoping for a job from the government after they retire, are they acting with as much independence and neutrality that they should while they are serving their office as judges of at the higher courts? So that itself is a big question. And interestingly, in this government, in the last 6 years, you've had a lot of conversation about this during the NJAC debates in the parliament. And also subsequently, Arun Jaitley himself had mentioned in the parliament about how judges should not be taking up post-retirement jobs, or that they do their jobs hoping for post-retirement benefits from the government.
Kindly review that unless it's absolutely essential, either some of these tribunals must be subsumed into the judicial setup, pay the judges who have retired and retired judges a pension equal to their last round pay. Because the danger is greater. The desire of a post-retirement job influences pre-retirement judgments. It's a threat to the independence of judiciary. And once it influences pre-retirement judgments, it adversely impacts on the functioning of our judiciary itself.
And you'd also had comments made in similar fashion by Union Minister Piyush Goyal. So at this time, Ranjan Gogoi's nomination, which is done by the government, although the president has powers to appoint as many as 12 members to the Rajya Sabha who are experts in their fields, it is a decision that the government takes, and the president acts on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So Ranjan Gogoi's appointment, that too, just 4 months after he retires. He retired, if you remember, only in November. And also his own complicated legacy in the Supreme Court, the legacy that he's left behind, and the kind of high stakes cases that he's handled involving this very government. So all of these put together has raised eyebrows on his nomination.
Could we look back at his tenure and talk about in what way this nomination changes the way we see it?
With Ranjan Gogoi, I think when we look at his legacy, the timeline really flows from before he became the Chief Justice of India. If you remember the January 12th press conference in 2017, where Ranjan Gogoi was, in fact, the senior most of the 4 judges who came out openly in rebellion against then Chief Justice Deepak Mishra, and basically talked about how democracy was in danger and that the Chief Justice somehow was being controlled by, they vaguely hinted at the government, and so the Chief Justice is being controlled by the government.
Another 20 years later, some very wise men in this country blame that Chalameshwar, Ranjan Gogoi, Madan Lokur and Kurian Joseph sold their souls They didn't take care of this institution. They didn't take care of the interests of this nation. All four of us are convinced that unless this institution is preserved and it maintains its equanimity, the democracy will not survive in this country or any country.
So from there, Ranjan Gogoi, because he was Chief Justice in line, there was a lot of speculation about whether he would be superseded. And then he famously made that speech. He delivered the Ramnath Goenka lecture where he said how sometimes independent journalists and noisy judges are required to be the first defenders of democracy.
On 19th of June of this year, the Indian Express had published a very insightful article. This was selected from The Economist, titled as How Democracy Dies. It said at one place, independent judges and noisy journalists are democracy's first line of defense. Reports of the death of democracy are greatly exaggerated. I'm quoting from Indian Express. But the least bad system of government ever devised is in trouble. It needs defenders. I agree. But I have a suggestion, a slight modification in today's context. Not only independent judges and noisy journalists, but even independent journalists and sometimes noisy judges.
So he started off with very high expectations, and his tenure was heralded as some sort of a new starting point for the judiciary and that he would bring in reforms. But the tenure was marked by one crisis after the other for the judiciary, including the sexual harassment allegations against Gogoi and how the court subsequently handled these allegations. While allegations being made was one aspect of it, if you remember, the very next day after the complainant, a Supreme Court staffer, wrote to all the judges of the Supreme Court of India, the Chief Justice at that point of time, Gogoi, convened an extraordinary hearing on a Saturday morning and said that these allegations were being made to somehow tarnish his image, and he brought about how his lack of a bank balance and talked about his integrity over the years. And the hearing subsequently was again, after it was criticized, that he presided over hearing in which allegations against him were being discussed. Subsequently, a committee was set up wherein the complainant wasn't really heard, and Gogoi was eventually given a clean chit. So this forms sort of the big part of Gogoi's legacy. Apart from that, the cases that he handled throughout his tenure as Chief Justice and before that, also, if you look at it, they're all not just political high-stakes cases, but also something that was directly in the center of all political campaigns, including the Rafale case that was the center of the opposition campaign for the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. So Ranjan Gogoi presided over the bench that basically called for NRC in Assam and monitored it. And eventually, it was a state BJP which rejected the outcome of the process. And this is when questions were raised about his potential conflict of interest, because he himself is an Assamese, and many questioned whether he should be heading the bench or even hearing this matter. But Gogoi nonetheless continued. Apart from NRC, like I mentioned, Rafale was one other big case that saw Gogoi's involvement, wherein, again, he refused to direct a central probe in the defense deal. And not just that, in fact, the contempt proceedings he initiated against Rahul Gandhi in that case, as part of that case, when Rahul Gandhi referred to the Prime Minister in that political slogan that was coined, Chaukidar Chor Hai. So the court intervening in this also became another political flashpoint. After that, you had the very, very sensitive Ayodhya case. Again, the manner in which this case was handled was, again, something that was discussed a lot in judicial circles. A day before the Ayodhya verdict was delivered, Gogoi held a very unusual meeting to review the security situation of the country before delivering the verdict. Critics immediately hit out saying it's not the job of judges to see whether law and order is maintained after a judgment or whether people will like a judgment or not. But even when the verdict was delivered, a 1,045-page judgment, in fact, was written without an author. It didn't say which judge had written the judgment, and this was, again, highly unusual for the Supreme Court to do so. Perhaps the first instance for the Supreme Court to do so. So, knowing fully well that the case was so politically sensitive, they did deliver that judgment, and eventually the judgment did form part of, the construction of Ram Mandir was part of this huge agenda that the Modi government has had in the run up to the Lok Sabha elections. So if you take stock of his legacy, how he's interacted with the government through these cases, and also otherwise in the sexual harassment case, although the government didn't openly take a stand one way or the other and kept saying that this is an internal matter of the judiciary, the two law officers, that is Attorney General K.K. Venugopal and Solicitor General Tushar Mehta, in court in that extraordinary hearing on Saturday, also chimed in and supported Justice Gogoi when he said that these allegations were unscrupulous. So that was this tacit support that law officers gave to the judge at that point of time. So with this complex legacy, Gogoi now being nominated to the Rajya Sabha is, of course, very problematic.
What kind of things have we heard from, the opposition and from his own colleagues about this?
So reactions have been coming in, and on Monday, Justice Lokur was amongst the first call out the move and criticized it. In fact, Justice Lokur was one of the 4 judges who was in that press conference along with Ranjan Gogoi. And all 3 of them, apart from Gogoi, Justices Chalameshwar, Lokur, and Kurian Joseph, all 3 of them had announced while they were serving in the Supreme Court that they would not take up any post-retirement jobs. And in some way, the same was expected out of Ranjan Gogoi. But Lokur was one of the first judges to criticize this move. From the opposition, you've already had Randeep Surjewala from the Congress, and Asaduddin Owaisi hit out at this move and said Owaisi, in fact, asked if this was a quid pro quo, if this was done in exchange for the judgments that Gogoi delivered.
Could you also talk about other examples of justices being appointed or being nominated for political positions in the past?
Of course, this is not the first time that such a nomination has been made by the president. This is the first time. But earlier, you had former Chief Justice Rangnath Mishra, who, after his retirement, presided over the committee that looked into the deficiencies during the 1984 Sikh riots. And Rangnath Mishra was appointed a Rajya Sabha member by the Congress government. Incidentally, he gave clean chits to then Congress government for its actions during the riots. So that was one political appointment that was criticized. But judges being appointed as governors, we've had 2 instances of that. In fact, the first female judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Fatima Bibi, was appointed a governor of Tamil Nadu. Very recently, Justice Sathashivam, who right after retirement was appointed the governor of Kerala. That was another move that was strongly criticized. But apart from that, these political appointments is what we are looking at. Historically, there have been some more where judges have attempted to contest presidential elections and, even stood for vice president elections. But this sort of complete political appointment is only the examples that I just gave you. So one of the things that Justice Gogoi's nomination has sort of done is open up this conversation again about the executive and the judiciary maintaining an arm's length between each other, and how the judiciary should work towards staying independent, and not just staying independent, but also appearing to be independent at these times.
In the end, we finished with a quick update about the new travel restrictions put in place by the Indian government and other new measures it has taken. Joining us is Avantika Ghosh, who reports on health and who has been covering coronavirus extensively for the Indian Express.
So on Tuesday morning, a fresh travel advisory has been issued, which basically prohibits travel of passengers to India from Afghanistan, Philippines, and Malaysia. No flight will take off from these countries for India after 3 p.m. IST. That's today. That's 3 p.m. today. And this is in effect till 31st of March. You will recall this comes right after Monday's travel advisory, in which airlines they had been requested not to board passengers headed for India from the European Union, the European Free Trade Association, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. Also, on Monday, the government had said that all passengers who have a travel history to UAE, Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait would have to undergo a 14-day period of quarantine. Earlier, this rule was only applicable for China, Italy, Iran, Korea, France, Spain, and Germany.
Are there any measures that the government has taken in terms of encouraging social distancing, which we've known helps contain the virus?
So on Monday, the Ministry of Health brought out a very detailed travel advisory where basically they said that sporting events should be postponed and students should stay away from schools and colleges, and online education should be encouraged. Then they were very clear that this 1 meter social distancing norm that should be maintained. Swimming pools, gyms, museums, all these things should ideally be closed. Then for restaurants, A, there should be proper cleanliness. B, they should encourage open air sitting rather than indoors. Local authorities have been told to regulate mass gatherings and keep the community constantly informed. So these are the social distancing advisories. These are the norms of the social distancing advisory that the Ministry of Health has issued.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show, as always, was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.